Hi there, Steve Kaufman here. Today I want to talk about something that I think is very important, and I want to sort of initiate a discussion. I want to hear comments from people. Maybe one day we can have a discussion over Skype with someone who has a different perspective on this. Today I want to talk about the basics and how we learn the basics, because so often we hear that, we have to master the basics. And and let's maybe go a step back. I think if we look at language learning, there are basically two tasks, in my opinion. One is to learn a lot of words, because we need words in order to understand and express ourselves. And the second task is to understand how the language works, the structure of the language. That's sometimes referred to as grammar. So the people who sort of prone the idea of, let's first master the basics, I presume they're talking about the basics of the structure of the language and some of the basic vocabulary. Now, I've also spoken in the past about sort of big picture learning the big picture, and the nuts and bolts. So to some extent, again, the basics are sort of the nuts and bolts. So how do we acquire these basics? In my view, and I'm going to refer to my experience with Arabic, it is impossible to master the basics up front. It is impossible to begin with the basics. That is one of the major faults of conventional language instruction. Whether it be trying to teach you certain structures in the language and then expecting you, because you do certain drills with these, that you're going to master them, I think that's wrong. Even in terms of vocabulary, so many books start out with things like colors. Why are colors basic? We don't know. The vocabulary you're going to need is going to depend on your interest. But the fact is, you're going to need a lot of vocabulary. And in my experience, the basics of the language don't start to make sense. We don't even have a chance of learning them until we have acquired a lot of words and been exposed to a lot of the language through, as you've heard me say before, input activities. So if I look at my Arabic learning, the sort of first invitation to learn Arabic was when I was at the Polyglot Conference in Bratislava. I met a gentleman who worked with Asimil in Germany, and I was chatting with him, and his name is Philippe, I think. He'll correct me if I'm wrong. I should have looked it up beforehand. And he said, this is the best book. And I had said one of the obstacles to me was the writing system. And he said, well, this is a great way to learn it. So I bought the Asimil system from him. He gave me a bit of a break. I looked into this book and I just found it overwhelming. I couldn't read the Arabic writing. They introduced the letters one by one. There was a lot, not to mention the fact that it's written for German speakers, and so therefore the kind of, call it romanizations, the pronunciation is for German speakers, so they have no way of showing the T, the and th sounds in Arabic, so they use some funny combination of German that was further confusing. Then on top of that, they introduced some niceties of the grammar. I left this book, just left it at home, didn't even bother with it. But I've come back to it, and that's what I'm going to talk about later on here. So then I had a quick overview of, then my friend Judith Mayer, who's a great polyglot, she suggested I try her book, which I went through. Learn to read Arabic, quickly master a new alphabet. Well, you don't quickly master any of the basics in a language. You start to get introduced to these things. I didn't, with all due respect to Judith, and I think it depends on how you learn, and many people love this book, I just couldn't do it because the letters were taught with reference to names of countries, cognates, things that we're familiar with. So if we see the name Cambodia, and then we see that written in Arabic, then that's going to help us learn the letters. I didn't find that. I just couldn't do that. I didn't want to look at a bunch of names of countries and cities and stuff like that. So this didn't help me. What I found eventually was that I just had to get in the language. And so as those of you who have been following, you know that I downloaded some tables of the letters of the Arabic alphabet and slowly, painstakingly started reading. I found out that I could actually type quite easily on my iPad in Arabic, so that after a while I started getting closer and closer to a sense of what these letters were, because they appear in different forms. I mean, it was difficult, and it continues to be difficult. But at least now I can kind of read, and of course I listen. And so I have read, I can't remember the statistic, 20 or 30,000 words in Arabic. I have listened to 100 hours of Arabic, 90, 100, I can't remember. I have listened to these 60 mini stories. That's been my main activity, just about the only thing I do. I've listened to them 30, 40 times, some of them. Lessons 1 to 20, I know quite well. 20 to 30 quite well, 30 to 40, a bit of a struggle, 40 to 50, a little more difficult, and 50 and beyond is even more difficult. But I know, because I have overcome the difficulty of the first 10 and the first 20 and then the first 30, that I will eventually get to the 60. And there is a lot of vocabulary there. And essentially all the basic structures of the language are there, and I have heard them. But in hearing them and in reading, there's a lot of stuff that I don't notice. And a lot of stuff that I wonder about. Why does it, go this way? I know what the story means. In fact, and this is a suggestion, one of the things that's very useful to do, after you have read I have read the story in Arabic, and I've saved words and phrases to my database, I've reviewed some words and phrases, there's still a few issues relating to tense, etc., that are a little bit fuzzy. Then I listen to the story, typically if I'm on my stepper at home, and I read the translation, because all of these stories have English, and not only English, they're translated into many languages. So I can listen to the story, which I've listened to before many times, which I've read in Arabic, and now I can listen to it and read it in English. And that helps clarify certain things about that story, so that when I next listen to it, I have a better sense of what's happening, not only the meaning, but also the structure of the language. I then went back to my Assimil book and struggled with their funny romanization, struggled with some other things. But what they do in this book is they introduce the basics. So now they go through explaining some of the endings of words, some of the tenses, some of the prepositions, what we would call prepositions, which often are slammed together with the word in Arabic, and how all of that works. And so as I do that, then I get a better sense. Now I can cope with the basics because I have a point of reference. I've been listening to and reading all this stuff. So I have a bit of a sense, just an almost intuitive sense of how the language works. I have a lot of words I can now read. That was another thing. When you start into, for example, even this book, which I glossed over the first time, all the examples they give you are in Arabic. So if I'm not that comfortable reading in Arabic, that's a block right away. I should add, by the way, that some of the books I bought on Arabic, the Arabic script is so small that it's ridiculous. As a learner, you want larger script. Another advantage of learning on an iPad is you can adjust the font size. At any rate, now that I can read Arabic, when they give some example verbs, I can actually read it comfortably. Plus, I've seen the verb and different verb forms in different texts that I've been listening to and reading. So when I read an explanation in here, it actually makes sense. The same is true, of course, with Assimil. And whereas this is a summary, and I very much recommend getting short summary grammars to refer to from time to time so that you can regularly refresh and get that overview of the grammar. This is a summary, whereas with Assimil, they give you sort of explanations as you proceed. Now, the disadvantage with Assimil is a lot of their content, at least I'm up to lesson 25, is largely uninteresting random sentences. It doesn't matter, but it gives you some explanation about the grammar. Explanations that I have either intuitively felt, experienced, or where I have had questions, or things that I simply didn't notice. Now, after going through 25 lessons on Assimil, I go back to my lessons at Link, my mini stories, and as I listen and as I read, I focus now on some of these column basics that I'm now more aware of, that I notice better. And as I notice them, I'm mining the same content that I've listened to 30 times, that I've read 5, 10 times. I'm mining it again with an emphasis on the basics. And now I see it. I see it. Now, one final thought. Language learning is not a 100-yard dash, okay? You don't master something right away. So I'm in no hurry. I have no idea. I haven't spoken Arabic, essentially. So I'm going to start speaking when I reach 3,000 known words. I don't know what will come out. But as I notice these structures better, I think I won't do too badly. And so I guess the key point here is that, and I didn't mention pronunciation, but the same is true of pronunciation, where they talk about the basics of pronunciation. Until you have heard a lot of the language, trying to refine your pronunciation, I think, is very difficult. Once you've heard a lot of it, then some of these basics, whether it be pronunciation, grammar, etc., you're now getting this specific, call it instruction, against a background, which is the big picture, that you have already absorbed. And therefore, things start to become clear. Whereas the attempt to teach these basics upfront too early, at least in me, creates resistance. I can't read. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know enough about the language. So the message here is the basics, we have to go back there over and over again. We might start with an overview, but then get into the language, get words into you, get experience with the language, and then go back to the basics. And then with this renewed sense of what happens in the language, go back to more input, more reading and listening. And then again, you can review the basics. That, to me, is how we learn the basics. And whatever we learn in languages, we forget. So we learn the basics, we forget the basics. We learn the basics, we forget the basics. That's how it works. Anyway, thank you for listening. I look forward to your comments.